Well, welcome to another episode of the Grazing Sheep Podcast. I'm your host, Big Tom Perkins, along with Dr. Cameron Miley. And again, today we're joined by Dr. Andrew Weaver. We're going to continue our discussion on EBVs. And so what EBVs are we talking about there, Cam?
So today I think we're going to get into fecal egg count, EBVs, or parasite resistance EBVs, and what those traits are and how we're selecting for them, maybe some of how they're evaluated. So the two EBVs on that list of selectable EBVs would be weaning fecal egg count and post-weaning fecal egg count, or WFEC and PWFEC. So Andrew, thanks again for joining us. This has been a lot of fun, I know, for us, and hopefully you guys listening at home or in the car have enjoyed this. And as always, if you don't understand something or have additional questions, reach out and we can hopefully touch on that in the future. But Andrew, if you want to just give a synopsis, I know a lot of your PhD work there at West Virginia University dealt with kind of the validation of these breeding values, and talk maybe a little bit about that side of things.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It's always great to be on the podcast, and appreciate the opportunity. Today's topic is one that's of particular interest to me. Spent quite a bit of time working with it, and still do quite a bit. So when we're thinking about fecal egg counts, and really what we're the kind of the root of this is parasite resistance, right? We're trying to breed sheep that are more parasite resistant, and fecal egg counts are the best metric that we have to do that. And so that's probably a topic for another day to get into the weeds there. But we think about selection for true parasite resistance. Fecal egg count is the number one trait that we have available right now to do that. And fortunately, we have a breeding value available to us through NSIP that allows us to select those individuals that have the genetic merit to decrease fecal egg count and subsequently, improve parasite resistance. So, as a reference point, when I talk about lowering fecal egg count, that's synonymous with improving parasite resistance. So, to get greater parasite resistance, we need to decrease fecal egg count. Lower fecal egg counts associated with fewer adult worms in the gut, and fewer adult worms in the gut means that animal was able to, hopefully fight off that infection and minimize establishment of those worms. And so we're using fecal egg count as an indicator trait to quantify parasite resistance in those animals.
So if we're going to get into the weeds just slightly, just tiptoe into the weeds briefly without a full-blown immunology discussion, when we're talking about parasite resistance, what are we actually selecting for?
Yeah, so I hear the terms thrown around a lot: resilience versus resistance, and we probably need to define those real quick. Resilience is the ability for an individual to continue to maintain a level of productivity in spite of a parasite infection or parasite exposure. And so a lot of times those are like our more mature ewes. They're animals that may have great FOMACHA scores, no need to deworm them, but they may be shedding eggs all over our pastures, which then younger, more susceptible animals could then pick up and have a serious problem with. And so resilience is great for the individual itself. That individual is healthy, they're fine, not a big deal, unless they're stressed, and then we may have problems. But really, resilience, it's great for the individual. It potentially, it could be a problem for other individuals in the environment, other animals in that pasture on that farm. Resistance, when we talk about resistance, we're really talking about those individuals, or the ability for an individual to recognize and respond to a parasite infection and prevent or eliminate establishment of adult worms. And consequently, you don't have adult worms, you don't have eggs in a fecal sample. And so by selecting for animals with lower fecal egg counts, we're selecting individuals. There's a relationship, obviously, more adult worms, higher fecal egg count. So if we're selecting individuals with lower fecal egg counts, those individuals should have fewer adult worms in their gut, which means hopefully, in theory, those animals are more parasite resistant. Remember, this is all done within contemporary groups. So we're evaluating these traits in animals that were all grazed on the same pastures at the same time and given the same opportunity for infection. That's a critical part of this. Those animals have to be challenged. they need to be exposed and have the opportunity to be infected with those parasites. And everyone in that group needs to have an equal opportunity, so that we can evaluate those that have those lower fecal egg counts that prevented parasite infection relative to those that may be allowed an infection to take place.
So when we're thinking about parasite resistance, certainly there's some breeds that come to mind, and I'd say as all Katahdin enthusiasts, we've heard the claim that Katahdin sheep are inherently parasite resistant, or parasite resistant, and I think a lot of times that's used as a marketing tool. Are there any comments on that, or kind of your thought on generalized parasite resistant animals being within a certain breed? And are there breeds that is true to say?
Yeah, so that's probably one of my pet peeves. You hear a lot like, buy my sheep, they're parasite resistant, or buy this breed or that breed because they're parasite resistant. And it just kind of makes me cringe inside, because most of our breeds, that would be an incorrect statement. There's a couple exceptions. Generally, our breeds of Caribbean origin, our St. Croix or Barbados blackbellies, they're very resistant breeds. The breed, where they're from, if they're not parasite resistant, they're dead. So natural selection has identified a population in those breeds that is very resistant. You can buy just about any St. Croix sheep, and they're going to be very parasite resistant. A lot of our terminal sire breeds tend to be more susceptible, although I'm not going to blanket label them as completely susceptible either, because we know that in Suffolk sheep, we're seeing some variation in fecal egg counts in Suffolk sheep. In Texel sheep, we see variations in fecal egg count in Texel sheep. So generally, those breeds are a little bit more susceptible, especially as we compare them to maybe a St. Croix, obviously. But those breeds, even within those breeds, there's opportunities for selection towards lower fecal egg counts and improved parasite resistance. And so the vast majority of our breeds fall into that category where there's a lot of variation within breed. And oftentimes, as with many other traits, there's more variation within a single breed than there is variation between breeds. And so what I mean by that is, I'll use Katahdins for an example. I can find Katahdin sheep that are as parasite resistant as a St. Croix. I can also find Katahdin sheep that are as parasite susceptible as our most susceptible Suffolk sheep. And so if we're not careful, if we just blanket label Katahdins as parasite resistant, if we're not actually quantifying that trait, and I just go out and buy any Katahdin because they're a Katahdin, I may end up with an animal that's very susceptible to parasitism. I might get lucky and find one that's resistant, but I also have a chance of finding that susceptible individual. So, data collection, quantifying this trait is very important so that we can identify those parasite resistant individuals within a breed that is known to be more parasite resistant than average.
So, Tom, have you seen any there? We've talked before on your grazing scheme. Have you seen any within the breed or within your subset of sheep that kind of show themselves or lend themselves to that more susceptible side? And then there's those that are kind of hands off and perform more like a Croix.
Oh yeah, definitely. We pull fecals on all these lambs, and we've got some that are just terrible. They're just loaded with with parasite eggs, and then we have some.
What kind of ranges?
They're really clean. What's that?
What kind of ranges are you seeing in those? Since you're actually pulling fecal egg counts, what kind of ranges are you seeing?
Not as bad as what I've heard some people say. I think our highest was only like 8,600, which is pretty high, but I've heard numbers way higher than that before. And
our highs will be over 10,000.
Yeah, and then we'll get some that are just 0 or 50 or 60 or
What's the group average, or what was it this summer?
Oh, we haven't pulled them yet this summer.
Okay,
we're still waiting. So last summer our average was like 561 or something like that. So I know they always say you want to be close to that 500 average, so that you're sure you're getting a good representation across that flock.
Yeah, and so you mentioned you haven't pulled them yet, so those would be post weaning fecal egg count
Mm-hmm.
values
Right.
or that sampling time. When we're thinking about, the two EBVs, we have a weaning fecal egg count and a post-weaning fecal egg count. Kind of what are our date ranges on that, and is there one that's better than another, or are they correlated enough that we can draw some conclusions from one to the other?
Yeah, so those traits they are correlated. Obviously, if you have higher fecal egg counts at weaning, you're going to probably have higher fecal egg counts at post weaning. Although you do see some exceptions. I've seen some sheep that may have a negative breeding value at fecal egg count breeding value at weaning, and then it's positive post weaning. So there's a little bit of variation there, obviously. One trait's quantifying parasite resistance, in that weaning time period. So they have some help from mom, and it's early life, type response to parasitism relative to, post-weaning fecal egg count is going to be, 2 months, 3 months, maybe 4 months post-weaning. That's really quantifying, can that animal handle it on their own? Without mom's assistance there, they've probably by that point, they've seen parasites a few times. So have they been able to develop an adequate immune response so that they can fight off that parasite infection all on their own? And so they are correlated, but there is a little bit of variation between the two.
So just for an example, you guys are pulling weaning fecal egg counts at NC State, correct?
Correct.
What type of fecal egg count levels are you seeing on those weaned lambs, or just at that kind of 60-day mark?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think it's going to vary for a lot of folks, depending, probably varies largely on geographically where you're at. For us, historically, I would say every year until this year, we've weaned. We have February 15 kind of average lambing date. We wean around April 15th, April 15 to April 20. Those animals are out on pasture as soon as we have grass, generally, early to mid-March. And we will run average fecal egg counts somewhere in that 1,000 to 1,500 egg per gram range. And I consider that pretty good, especially for that early in the season. We are, relatively far south. I know other producers that are even further south than us that have even higher averages that early in the year. I say up till this year. This year we changed our timing up a little bit. We lambed just a week or two later. We weaned May 1st, and we also incorporated some annual forages into our production system. And we talked about that on the previous podcast. We actually struggled quite a bit to get a significant enough infection for it to really be meaningful this year at weaning, just because those animals, I don't know if it was the grass, I don't know if it was the year or the weather. I don't know if it was the genetics that we utilized this year. I can't pull out one or another. But all I can say is our average fecal egg counts were very low this year at weaning.
And we could speculate that annual forage, kind of a changing of environment for the worm population, could be the greatest cause of that. At least that would be my thought. And that's, I think, one of the biggest struggles people have with looking at these EBVs and having a degree of confidence in them is it's so dependent on environment. We're not just dealing with performance of the lamb. We require that parasite and that biological cycle for that animal, or for the nematode to go through, that we're dependent on a secondary organism to give us the data that we need to collect. And so timeline, we're looking at 60 days roughly in that range for weaning fecal egg count. On post-weaning fecal egg count, if you were weaning there in April or the 1st of May, your post-weaning fecal egg counts would then be pulled sometime this summer, correct?
Correct. You want to at least absolute minimum of 30 days after your weaning fecal egg counts are taken. And also, if you do have to deworm, remember, deworming is going to disrupt that contemporary group, because that animal has a low, if you deworm one or two animals, their low fecal egg count is a result of the dewormer. It's not a result of their genetics. And so we need to wait. The recommendation is that we wait at least 30 days after the last deworming, at least, before taking another fecal sample to be utilized for analysis. At least 30 days, probably 60 days is better after that weaning fecal to take your post-weaning fecal to get a little bit of spread there. So keep that in mind. Another recommendation that is often given, fecal egg counts are not the cheapest trait to measure, obviously. A weight trait, you run them across, you've purchased the scale at some point, and you can run thousands of sheep across that scale before it breaks and you have to buy a new one. Fecal egg counts, you're paying for every fecal, for every sample that you collect. There are low-cost fecal egg counts provided by 3 institutions. That information is available on the wormx.info website. And so I encourage you to check that out. They're $5 to $7 per sample, which is dirt cheap compared to what a veterinarian will charge you. And they will quantify fecal egg counts so that you can use that for genetic analysis. They will not diagnose disease. They'll just quantify fecal egg counts so that you can submit that to NSIP. So I encourage you to use that resource if you're interested. But that said, if you're going to spend $5 to $7 per sheep that you're going to submit a sample on, you want to make sure that it's meaningful. I'd hate to do all that work to collect samples, send them in, pay $5 a sample, and then them all come back 0, and not, I say I'll come back 0. That would be great. My sheep aren't infected. That's wonderful, but I don't have a significant enough infection at that point for it to really be useful for genetic evaluation, because like Tom said, we need at least 500 eggs per gram contemporary group average. And so one recommendation is wait until you need it. Wait until there's a few sheep in your contemporary group that require deworm. And so just hold off on collecting a fecal and just watch FAMACHA scores. And as you get later on into the spring and into the summer, if you start seeing, maybe 1, 2, 3, 5 sheep that are showing a little bit more anemia, maybe FAMACHA's 3s, that tells you that those sheep have been exposed to parasites. There's something going on in their gut. And now is probably a safe time to collect a fecal on the entire population and send that in. And your chance of success, your chance of having a high enough contemporary group average is better in that scenario. So that might be one trick that might be useful to make sure you have high enough counts.
So when we're talking about contemporary groups and contemporary group averages, when we're thinking about the fecal egg count EBV and knowing that we have animals on both sides of the spectrum for positive and negative values, why is that 500 egg per gram value so important? And how is that being calculated to give us an animal that is negative? What does that negative number show us from a quantitative standpoint?
Yes, that's a loaded question. So I'll first get at the need for a challenge. Why do we say that we need at least 500 eggs per gram? Wouldn't it be great if all of our sheep were 0? I mean, that's the perfect scenario, right? We turn sheep out to grass, they're out on grass all summer, we do a fecal and they're all 0. They have no infection. I think that's what we all strive for someday.
And some people are doing it.
Some people are already there or really close. And that is wonderful. That's what all of the rest of us, hope that we can get to at some point. We would love to be able to turn sheep out on grass and never worry about them, and for parasites to not be a non-issue for us, because we've utilized genetics to be able to get them to a point where they don't require, any deworming assistance, et cetera. But unfortunately for most of us, that we're not there yet. And so we need to deal with this fecal egg count of 0. And what does a fecal egg count of 0 really mean? And it can potentially mean 2 things. One is that, and this is the ideal scenario, they're a fecal egg count of 0 because they have genetic resistance to internal parasites. They have the immune system, they have the genetics that they need to fight off and completely prevent the establishment of those parasites. And that's great. But it could also mean, if we have that fecal egg count of 0, it could also mean that they were never exposed to worms in the first place. If they're never exposed, they were never challenged, they're going to have a fecal egg count of 0, but it's not because they have the genetics to resist an infection. It's just because they were never exposed. They never had the chance to be infected. Had they been exposed, maybe they would be super infected, super susceptible. So We need to be able to sort that out. And that's really where that fecal egg count, the average of 500, comes into play. We need to ensure that our sheep were adequately challenged. We need to make sure that as a group of lambs out there grazing, that they had the opportunity to be infected. And so we say 500 eggs per gram is an average that would tell us that, okay, these sheep, they've been exposed. They've had the opportunity to be infected. Some sheep did get infected. Some sheep may not have gotten infected, but at least those that did not get infected, they had the opportunity to be infected, and they had the genetics to be able to fight off that infection. And so, obviously a higher average is maybe even better because it tells us that there is that much more exposure, and we can really sort out those that are resistant from susceptible. But 500 is where we like to start. If your entire group is 0, they may all be parasite resistant, but they could just as well be, all parasite susceptible and just not exposed, if that makes sense. So once we have that average, then we can start identifying who's below average and who's above average and start sorting out those positives and negatives. Who's going to decrease fecal egg count, who's going to increase fecal egg count.
And from an NSIP data collection standpoint, I know, Tom, you and I have had a lot of discussions on kind of some mismanagement or overgrazing some areas on purpose. So, you need, as Andrew mentioned, you need a parasite infection in those lambs. We want to see differences. So, you've gone as far as purposefully infecting those lambs or purposefully managing those lambs in a fashion to ensure that there is an infection so that the cost of that data collection doesn't go to waste.
Yeah.
And so maybe, do you mind speaking to that point?
Yeah, we would take the whole flock and put them on what we would typically graze for 1 day, and we'll graze for 2 days or a day and a half. And then we'll go back to our regular grazing, and we'll come back to that area at 30 days with just those lambs and have them graze that and basically overgraze it again, with the idea that they're picking up all those L3 larvae that are in there and putting as many of those in their gut as possible. And then we wait 2 to 3 weeks as soon as we start to see some signs of bottle jaw, and then we get them all gathered up and start pulling those fecal samples. And as soon as we pull those fecal samples, though, we worm everybody because we're not taking a chance of losing anybody. So that's the only time we'll ever do just a blanket worming across everyone. And we've been sending those into Virginia Tech and getting that information back. But that's,
I would say,
purposely, trying to make sure that they're getting infected.
Yeah, and I would say, I think there's a couple of folks like you, Tom, that are doing similar things to try to get lambs infected. I think it's probably worth noting that, practices like that are probably maybe reserved for our seed stock producers like Tom, like a few other folks. People that have quite a bit of experience with raising sheep and parasite-rich environments, that have been, active in NSIP and really trying to identify those parasite-resistant individuals. But I think if some of you maybe are a little bit more new to NSIP or new to sheep production in general, feel free to reach out with questions on getting some of this information collected. I'd hate for you to have more severe health consequences by putting lambs into that type of scenario. Although I do realize that if you want good data, sometimes for NSIP and to get these breeding values, sometimes we resort to those types of methods. And even after our ryegrass experience this spring, I'm almost like, oh man, I might need to do something similar next year to make sure our lambs get infected.
It's not
it's a double-edged sword. It's like exactly.
And the other thing too, you have to think, Tom's invested time and energy on the genetic side of things to breed sheep that are more resistant. And so, whereas, the everyday producer might need to just continue with their improved management and still have a parasite problem. Mm-hmm. I think it's a testament to, selection of those EBVs that you now have to go out of your way to mismanage those animals. I know it's killing you to graze that paddock for more than one day.
Mm-hmm.
And but you're doing it to collect the data. And so that's a great point, Andrew. It isn't for the faint of heart, and it's a very specific reason for the mismanagement.
I can just from it. I mean, my experience when I started here in my current position, we had a small flock of Katahdin ewes. They were not in NSIP, no real selection for parasite resistance other than survival of the fittest. And it was not hard to get those sheep infected. And so I would say if you're new, if you're interested in collecting some of this information, go through a year or two, collect fecal egg counts, do weaning fecals, post-weaning fecals. Just keep managing as you would normally manage and as you should manage for good sheep and forage health. Collect those fecals at the appropriate time points and see what they come out as. And more than likely, my bet would be that those sheep are adequately infected. If you're collecting those fecals, early to midsummer, or when a few of them need deworming, collect a fecal, you're probably going to have adequate numbers. Now, 5-10 years from now, if you determine that fecal egg count's a really important trait to select for, and you continue to select for it generation after generation, and you get those super low -80, -90, -100 fecal egg count EBVs, when you get to that point, maybe we need to come back and revisit some of the stuff we just talked about in terms of maybe challenging those sheep a little bit harder to sort out those minute differences in parasite resistance and susceptibility once our flock average becomes quite resistant.
Yeah, and while we're talking about averages for the Katahdin breed and those that are collecting data, average weaning fecal egg count is -31. Average post-weaning fecal egg count is -28. So can you speak to what that negative means? What does it mean when I'm looking at a sale catalog and somebody's offering sheep that are -80, which would be in the top 5% of the breed for parasite resistance? Obviously, and I think we've already touched on this, we want more negative animals. I know our EAPK kind of rundown, Dr. Bowdrich had a talk in there about selecting for parasite resistance without impacting our other economically relevant traits. And so certainly we don't want to single trait select for parasite resistance. We'd like sheep that still grow and perform in our production system, but we can make a lot of advances or a lot of advancement in selecting for parasite resistance as well as our other relevant traits. So what does that negative value mean? And what are we selecting for?
Yeah, so when this breeding value was developed, the units were or the units that it is currently calculated as that it was originally calculated in is a percentage, as a percent change. So I know we measure fecal egg counts in eggs per gram, but in the calculation and the generation of these breeding values, it's converted to a percent change. And so when you see like -30 or -100 or +50, you can put a percentage behind that. And so it'd be a decrease of like a -30 would be a decrease of 30%. A -100 would be a decrease of 100%. Obviously, you can't reduce something more than 100%. 100% reduction in something is completely getting rid of that thing. So those are the most parasite resistant individuals in the population. A fecal egg count, EBV of -100 means they eliminate that parasite infection. They should have close to a 0 fecal egg count. Those are going to be our most parasite resistant animals. On the other side of things, and remember it's relative differences too. So it's not, we're not saying that a -30 is going to have a fecal egg count of 500 eggs per gram every time. We're saying a -30, the difference between a -30 and a -100 is 70%. So it's going to be a percent change. And so we're really just looking at relative percent differences in fecal egg count in our sheep populations. Obviously, negative values are good. Negative values indicate a decrease in fecal egg count. But keep in mind the breed average is around negative 30. So if you're above a negative 30, your sheep are more, or that individual is more susceptible, or is going to have higher fecal egg counts than the average of the Katahdin breed.
Right. And kind of the validation of that again, what was the spread like, or just could you give us a rundown of what that project looked like, and really why do we need to validate this type of data, and what type of confidence should it instill for our producers, whether commercial or seed stock, in that selection?
Yeah, so some of my graduate work, WVU was validating the fecal egg count breeding value, and we took 5 rams with extremely low fecal egg count breeding values, and then we took 5 rams with extremely high fecal egg count breeding values, and so the spread on those rams was over 300% in fecal egg count EBV. So we took those rams and we randomly bred them to a group of ewes. So no selection on the female side, just randomly took those ewes, put them in breeding groups with those rams, and then evaluated their offspring. And as we would expect, the lambs that are sired by low fecal egg count rams have lower fecal egg counts than lambs sired by high fecal egg count. So, I mean, long and short, it works. If you breed the low fecal egg count rams, you're going to have lower fecal egg counts in those offspring, compared to breeding to a higher fecal egg count ram. And more has come out of that as time has gone on. And I think Dr. Bowdridge may be able to provide more detail on that into the future here. And if any of you have been to any of his talks recently, I think that's some pretty fascinating stuff that has grown out of our divergent mating scheme with fecal egg count that we've developed over the last 5 to 6 years. But every year, I mean, my project was just 2 years of random breeding. And we saw those differences, and it's been in year 3, in year 4, in year 5, in year 6. Every year we have this beautiful spread in fecal egg count, with the high fecal egg count sired lambs being higher fecal egg counts, low fecal egg count sired lambs having lower fecal egg counts. There's never been a year where it's not worked out with averages that trend in the direction that they're supposed to.
And I would definitely say, seeing those sheep and kind of the theme of having these genetic discussions here on the Grazing Sheep podcast has been just knowing what you're buying, having a full picture of what genetics you're investing in. I mean, there were rams in that study that were extraordinarily high, truly outliers for fecal egg count breeding values, but through phenomenal looking lambs. I mean, by far, the best Katahdin looking sheep in that trial, and I'd argue would be very acceptable to a lot of Katahdin producers, regardless of what your end goal is, whether it's the show ring or commercial production. And it just goes to show, that ram might be beautiful, and he might be producing lambs that are exceptional for growth, are exceptional for phenotype and a lot of other traits, but without that numeric, that quantitative look at what he's actually providing to the lamb crop, those lambs may not make it in Virginia, North Carolina, Ohio in a bad year when exposed to a parasite infection.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned a good point right there. We don't negative 100 fecal egg count breeding values are great, but we probably don't all need to have negative 100s. This trait, like many others, is optimizing may be ideal. If I'm you in Ohio or Tom in Pennsylvania, a negative 50 might be sufficient, but it's going to vary. Some operations negative 50 might be sufficient. Others might need a negative 80, and that's for you to sort out and utilize some of those genetics and see what works and what doesn't, and kind of figure out where that optimal is. If I live in South Georgia, a negative 100 is probably the only option I have. If I don't have a negative 100, they're probably not going to live through the summer. And so that's where we have to understand our environment, our parasite burden, what they're going to be exposed to. And find the genetics that work for us in our environment. And that's going to vary. I don't want to sit here and say that, everyone in the country has to have a negative 100. Maybe they do. But that's, I think, for you all to sort out in your own operations and kind of figure out where that optimal point is, for this trait as well as, many others.
Yep, that's absolutely true. Well, we're coming up on our time here, guys, and it's been great catching up with you guys and really enjoying going into these EBVs and what all they entail. So we thank you for listening to the podcast. If you want to reach out to us, you can do that by contacting me at bigtomperkins@gmail.com. There's a Facebook page. We'd like you to go on there and find the Grazing Sheep podcast and like and follow and all that fun stuff. Leave us some comments, ask us some questions. So you guys have a good evening, and we'll probably catch up with you at Expo.
Sounds good, Tom. Looking forward to it.
Thanks for having me on again.
You bet. We'll see you now. Bye.